welcome to the July 24th CNAB public meeting. The agenda is linked in chat. I'll do it one more time just for anybody that joined late. So we'll start out with any new folks. I don't see anybody new on the line, but if you have been here and not introduced yourself, feel free. Okay, any demos that anybody would like to show? Okay, so the first item on the agenda is the 1.0 or CNAB core spec working group approval status. If you go to the link there, I can share my screen, I guess. That defines the process for how things are approved by the working group and then how they progress beyond that. Let me share my screen in 1 second. Let me make sure nobody notifies me about anything crazy. There we go. So we've been following this process, this defined in 901-process.md, and we're currently in the draft stage. And I think we've burned through most of the issues that are related to what we thought would be in the backlog for 1.0. I can open that up as well. Let's see it. Type. So in our core 1.0, the only thing that's in there currently is the resolve the immutable and read-only behavior of parameters discussion. And I think the consensus between the people that had commented on the issue, at least, was that we should remove immutable for now and rely on the read-only behavior. And then after we do a 1.0 of the spec, we can revisit how we can use the existing JSON schema with some additions, maybe to get the same kind of behavior without introducing the immutable attribute by itself. Kind of conflicts with the way we've been using JSON schema for almost everything else. So with that in mind, I think we'd like to resolve this as soon as possible. So anybody else that wants to go and comment on that, feel free. And then we would like to follow the process and move into the working group approval status. We don't really define exactly how we submit this in this document. So I'd like to propose that we open a PR that changes the core specs version from draft to working group approval, and then have all of the people in the owners file either approve via GitHub mechanisms or request changes and comment why they think there are things that we need to do. And we'll use that as a mechanism for voting. And then we can submit it and move on to the final approval state, which is when the executive director of the spec body, which in this case is Matt Butcher, and then any approving people that are on that will be on the JDI board will also approve, and then we can move the process along. Does anybody have any objections to that, or have anything in mind right now that would prevent us from calling this a 1.0? I think the only other thing that might be a sticking point is the renaming of the verbs. But I didn't think we had any clear answer on what we wanted to do with that right now. So I'll open it up for any discussion there right now.
I feel a little bit uncomfortable that there's no complete implementation of the spec before, like, I kind of would prefer if we'd finish, like, outputs are still, like, haven't quite been finished with in Duffle yet. I kind of would prefer if Duffle had, like, finished implementing all the required features before we, like, had a complete, like, we marked it, like, completely 1.0. Like, the draft is sort of, like, kind of finished, and then if you have a complete implementation, then you're, like, really sure all the features are implementable together, like they've been tested in code. I understand if you don't want to do that, but that's like the only thing that sort of bugs me about the going 1.0 without like a complete implementation of all of it.
Sorry, I muted myself again. Do you think that could happen between the working group approving the draft of the spec and final approval of it, or do you think we should finish the implementation of outputs probably in cnab-go or draft before we validate it.
I'm not super familiar with how these steps go. If you think that a different timing would be appropriate, I feel like if one of these steps of it getting more becoming 1.0, like one of these steps we should stop unless we've finished a complete implementation.
I mean, there might be an advantage in going to draft and then completing the implementation in Duffle before going to approve, because that would at least stop Duffle having to chase a moving target.
Yeah, I agree. That's been a problem keeping cnab-go and Duffle up to date with the frequent changes that we've had for things. Any other input?
I mean, I might as well say it. I'm a bit surprised there's no compliance test suite, because how do we know that Duffle is an implementation? Implementation of what? You know, it's just a paper spec at the moment. But I think that's too big to bite off for 1.0. So having said that, I'll shut up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, if we had to make that call whether to have the reference implementation work, we'd need to know what is lacking. And right now, outputs definitely comes to mind. That's something like we're working on right now. But even that, you know, I'm not 100% sure it would make it within one of these like timeline gaps. And that's just one feature. So
sure.
So with an action item for this would be to make sure that we have a list of everything that Duffle does not currently implement from the proposed 1.0 final specification. Would that be a good thing to have in the next couple of days?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, I'm also taking notes, so thanks.
I can take an action item to for myself to generate that list of things that are missing in Duffle so far, unless anybody else wants to own that. Okay, I'll assign that to myself then. So we'll, I guess we'll just iterate on this in Slack a little bit. Oh, Ralph wants to do it. Yeah, Ralph? No? Okay.
You are muted.
It's the worst. So Ralph, do you want to do the gap analysis, or is it okay if I do that?
Well, why don't you go ahead and do this one? I'll
Okay,
definitely
cool.
be stepping in soon.
Perfect. So with that in mind, we'll just iterate on this in Slack a little bit more and figure out what we want the gating factors to be before we move forward. And I'll take the action item to make the gap list. So the next thing on the agenda was claims and custom fields inside of the claims. So currently cnab-go has an implementation of a claim that I think came from Duffle originally and has some things in it that are not part of the spec, specifically dealing with relocation. So Glenn and I had been having a little bit of a chat to discuss how we wanted to handle that and whether we needed to update the claim definition to allow other things, whether the existing custom piece was sufficient and what we needed to do, or if we needed to address it a separate way. So I wanted to open it up for discussion. Do people think that the claim, so in the claim JSON schema, there is a custom attribute and it's just a generic object. It has no restrictions. So kind of like in the bundle where we can put additional things in the extensions, in the custom extensions area. I think the claim allows similar things. However, it's not called out in the markdown for describing the claim. So we probably need to fix that. But is that the right approach? Does anybody have any different opinions about what we should do for things that are non-standard, but tooling like Duffle will use for claims?
I guess one question is, are claims meant to be transportable between runtimes? Because if you did an install like using runtime A and then you want to do an uninstall using runtime B, then you might need to get hold of the relocation information. But you should have that to hand by some magic process anyway. But if it's in the claim, so much the better. But obviously, if it's in the custom part of the claim, it's useless to you.
I'm not sure if the claims are supposed to be portable between runtimes or not. That's a good question. Does anybody have feels about that?
I don't know how you could. That would be really difficult, especially if your runtimes are written in different languages and on top of different underlying infrastructure. That part might be very difficult because now you're coupled finally, right? You've taken something abstract and you've actually made it real. So it may be hard to manage it that way. I don't know.
That being said, for things as important as relocation, maybe we should think about having a formalized way of encoding that information.
I think that's what we would have to do. That sounds like something for the future for sure.
Yeah, from my point of view, it's certainly a feature that people will eventually want and which will strengthen the ecosystem if it existed. But it seems like that would take a good bit of deep thought and would take some time.
Okay, so the flip side is if claims are just for use by a particular runtime, what's the spec? What's the interest in the spec of having a claims schema? Why is it there?
Well, if I understand correctly, that I would imagine that the schema can be readable if it's in the spec. It's not clear what you can do with that readability without further work. Do I misunderstand?
Yeah, so you could build tools to analyze claims that came out of multiple runtimes, I guess. Debug tools, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking like the bar here is more like the ability to understand what is in play if you have access to that claims instance, but in the sense of like reflection or any of that kind of thing. It's the ability to observe what's going on around the tooling you happen to be using. As a first step toward moving forward to the ability to, carry those claims from one tool to another, which we wouldn't do now, but certainly is worth thinking about doing in the future.
Yeah. So from that perspective, it might make sense to allow the relocation information to go temporarily in the custom section, and then we can kind of promote it when we've got some comfort with it and sure it's going to work.
The way I've been thinking about claims is kind of through the lens of how Terraform state can be backed by different storage providers. So in the same sense, you could have pluggable backends for your CNAB state, or like you could have an API-based remote claim store that implements the claims spec, and then you can just add support for that across multiple tools.
I also received
Yeah, and that was one of the initial ways we intended claims to be used.
For the record, we're working on an implementation of an API-based claim store right now that we hope to open source.
On the total opposite end of the spectrum, we have a runtime that does not use claims or a representation of a claim at all because it's not required as far as like the primary spec. For us, we've thought of claims as a possible future mechanism for portability of the internal data representing an installation, but there's already like chunks of data that are missing that you would need to fill out in order to make that type of portability possible. And it's not clear in the spec that that was like the intended ultimate use. So for us, we have a runtime that works and is compliant, but does not use claims at all because the spec makes no requirement of you having to use claims.
It explicitly says you don't have to use claims. Like it's okay, so I think the answer there is we can use the custom section for now. Claims are something that's beyond the spec or the core spec anyway, so we can continue to iterate on that independently of the core stuff. Okay, the next thing on the agenda was, up there, sorry. Stabilizing dependencies for 1.0. I had a related item discussing probably doing something like validation through implementation as we propose new things. I think Leah also suggested that we should do that for the core part of the spec, and I agree. So Radu, do you want to take this, and then I'll kind of piggyback off of that with what we've been doing in Porter?
Yeah, sure, thanks. The problem here is fairly simple. We have a lot of pinpoint dependencies of random hashes for projects, and
different dependencies. Sorry.
And they're different dependencies. So I'm really struggling to find out a coherent strategy to go back and use versions for that, mainly because sometimes there is no version either released or compatible across the things that we want to use. The question I have here is people who have more experience in vendoring Go projects. Is there a strategy for this? Otherwise, whenever we have a new version or a new dependency, we're just gonna have to go ahead and do the dance of juggling across multiple hashes until your project compiles. And I'm not sure, I really don't think that's a reasonable thing to ask every time.
That's some serious silence right there.
That response really makes sense.
Sorry, is there a GitHub issue for this?
Let me search for it. If there isn't, I'm going to open one right now.
Okay.
Which repo are you going to open it in?
Yeah.
Well, that's another good question, because our dependencies are shared across cnab-to-OCI, cnab-go, Duffle, and partially Porter. Mm-hmm. So that it would also, we would have to have a coordinated effort for this.
The snark in me wants a brand new repo, just for the sake of discussion. But that's snark.
I mean, presumably there are no cyclic dependencies amongst these repos, so we could just go from the leaves up to the tops.
I have a related question. Sylvan, do you guys plan on doing releases for cnab-go or for cnab-to-OCI, or is that something that is just going to stay on master for a while?
Yeah, I was planning to do that shortly. I had an issue about that.
Okay, any more discussion on that? Good. Okay, so the last item, I misread Radu's thing about stabilizing dependencies, and I thought that it meant dependencies in terms of like CNAB dependencies or bundle dependencies. And one of the things that I had thought about was, we have this problem with the spec, and Leah pointed it out, but we also have this problem as we start to define other things like extensions or further specs. And dependencies particularly, I think is still underdefined in terms of what the spec has in it versus what's going to be necessary when things are implemented. And we started trying to implement that in Porter right now, and we've run into a couple of things that we want to propose back into the spec. So I thought that it would make sense, and maybe this is an addition to our 901 process document, but working in other situations or other kind of spec things, I found it useful to have like a step of validation through implementation before things would move on. We did this with the Open Service Broker API. How do people feel about having something like that as a modification to our process for evaluate or promoting specs as we go along?
If I recall discussion from a couple of weeks before, we had in mind that any change specification that someone would propose would also have to come with a proposed implementation in Duffle. Would that make sense to your question?
Yeah, I think probably. I don't know if we have codified that anywhere in documentation. We probably should.
I mean, a consequence of that would be that if we end up with optional pieces like claims, for example, but if we end up with optional pieces of the spec, Duffle will need to implement them all. So I don't know whether that's manageable long term or not.
So could it be any public tool that can be reviewed by everybody, not just Duffle? Duffle obviously has to be the reference implementation for the core pieces, but dependencies don't necessarily need to be implemented by Duffle. Dependencies could be implemented by Porter or some other tool, and any other extensions could do the same. Is any publicly available tool that can be reviewed something that can satisfy that criteria?
That feels a bit weak to me because a tool could come and go. Mm-hmm. It'd be nice to have a stable implementation somewhere. So
where's the middle ground between too much for Duffle and some other tool? What should that be?
You could argue that if you want something in the core specification, then Duffle should implement it. And probably we might not agree that it should be a part of Duffle, but at least a PR with the proposed implementation for a spec change should be provided for every spec change. I think that could be a middle ground, even if it doesn't end up being implemented or being accepted.
I think for core things, that's definitely true. Anything that's in the core spec definitely should be in Duffle. I think the gray area for me comes down to this dependencies specification that's in 5, I think. Hold on. Let's see what section it is. 500. That isn't core spec, and it's optional. People can implement it or not implement it. How do we validate those things?
I think it makes sense to have a weaker validation for things that are optional. Like core things should go in Duffle because Duffle needs to be compliant with the spec. Mm-hmm. You want to have all the core things together in the same implementation. For things that are optional, I think it kind of makes sense to have a weaker, like it's just like they're already optional. Not everybody has to do them. If they don't all work together, that's like not a critical failure of the spec. It's like not great, but it's not like the spec still works. It's just like unfortunate. And so like if like a different tool implements every feature because that tool wanted a feature and like a couple of tools end up implementing it, then that's fine. So I feel like a tool that we can see the implementation of to see that like it sort of makes sense is like what you stated would be sufficient for me. Like just like that is implemented at all, that you thought through it enough that you could write it down in code.
I guess an additional restriction for that would be the current version of the tool that implements the non-core specification would also have to implement the current core specification. I think that should also be a restriction for any tool that we allow in this process.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's possible for Duffle to implement everything at the moment. And if we can keep it that way, so much the better. We'll cross the bridge when we get to it if it's not possible to contain that.
Okay. So I want to open a PR against the 900 section to add some words about this. Does anybody have any problem with that? Okay, I'll drop a link into Slack when I get that done. I think that was all of our agenda today. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add or discuss?
Okay, just a quick one. Where are we with the Linux standardization stuff? Relative to going 1.0, it seemed to be in a race there.
Yeah, so I asked Matt about that. Let me scroll back and find it in my DMs to him. Paperwork and marketing, and then there are some other partner companies that are also going to sign on, so they're filling paperwork out. I think August 15th is the date now that is targeted for announcing things.
Okay, so it sounds like we won't need to go final before we've got that standards body in place.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? I guess I have one more question. Is everybody still happy with the every 2-week meeting frequency, or is more often or less often desired?
I think it's good frequency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you guys.